Well, hey everyone, it's Hudson. I'm going to delve in and do this full setup video on how to set up your Nikon Z30. I'm going to assume most of you that are watching this probably haven't watched one of my other setup videos, whether on the Z50 or the Z6, Z7, Z6 II, Z7 II, Z9. Probably the Z30, I'm just going to assume is sort of your entry to the Nikon Z world. So I'm going to walk through each of the menus. I'm going to assume you know where the local control buttons on the camera are. I'll describe them a bit, but that should be as easy as taking a look in your menu. And I'll talk through some of the video settings as well, because I think this camera is better suited to people, particularly people who vlog, who create content where they're talking to the camera like I am right now. I think this thing ups the game significantly for those using a GoPro or a cell phone right now. I think if you're really looking to use this camera for still photography, you're missing out a little bit, not paying that little bit of extra and getting the Z50's wonderful electronic viewfinder. It just really helps with envisioning what's going on in the world, looking through that beautiful viewfinder. But, you know, there are some things I love about this camera, some things that bug me a little bit. You know, if you're curious about watching my review of this camera, I'll link it right here. So let's just delve in. Let's not take too much more time. And I'm going to go in, I'm going to hit menu. I'm in photo mode right now. And I'm going to go straight from the sort of the top to the bottom. You know, when we go into our playback menu, there's only a few things I would set up, like in playback display options. I think it's really important to be able to put that red, green, and blue histogram on there for when you're, this is more for photography modes, when you're playing back photography, but it'll even show you on the video too. Having that red, green, and blue histogram display really is nice for judging whether your exposure was right. And I like having none, picture only. So generally, my selections for that, you just push the right arrow and it deselects or selects, and you have to hit OK. I like exposure info, red, green, and blue histogram, and shooting data. And what does all that mean? Well, if I hit play and we take a look at, you know, some image that I've photographed. There was a blurry one. Here's one I shot for a video. And I hit the up and down on that little round D-pad on the back around the OK button. There's my exposure information. There's my red, green, and blue histogram. There's a composite histogram that shows all the colors combined. Left is black, on the right is white, and that's the spatial distribution of red, green, and blue within that image. And you can tell whether you've blown out the red channel in the highlights or blocked up the blue channel in the shadows. It really gives you a nice representation. Or back to nothing, all right? Jumping back into menu. Picture review, I don't like having picture review on. That's when you take a picture and then it shows you the picture you just took. It slows me down in my shooting. I'd rather hit play to see that picture instead of stopping in between each picture. Rotate tall, well, what does that mean? Well, if I turn that on, when I shoot a vertical image, it'll show it as if it's horizontal. It'll put a little vertical image in the back screen, and I get a smaller look at it that way. It shrinks everything because it puts the long dimension on the short side of the screen. And so I don't do that. I just turn the camera to the side to look at a tall image, to have more detail of it without zooming in. You can run a slideshow or rate your images. So that's your playback menu. We go into the photo shooting menu. You can always reset it. That would just reset it to all your defaults. You can name the storage folder. You can customize the name of that folder. NZ30 is fine for me. File naming. I like to customize this. I go in and I name it Z30. You can run through here. You can use the touch screen. You can say Z30, boom, by using the touch screen. Say OK. And that I work with multiple cameras. This way, every image coming out of the camera is labeled with what camera it was. Choose image area. You could choose something smaller than your DX crop. You could shoot 16:9 photos or 1:1 square crop photos. That's just cropping in on the sensor. I generally leave it in that DX mode. Image quality, I'd really suggest RAW. If you're shooting RAW plus JPEG, you can choose what size that JPEG is going to be, that compressed file. Just know that a JPEG is a very small fraction of the data that you captured. It's much harder to work on a JPEG image than a RAW image. You have less latitude in the color and the exposure and in going through and processing that image in post-production. So you really want to stick with RAW. RAW recording, I like 14-bit. That's just more information, more potential tonal range instead of 12-bit. Your ISO sensitivity settings, you're also going to have that on that button up there near the shutter button, the ISO button. But you can select the ISO sensitivity here. You can turn auto ISO on or off. And you can set a maximum. I set my maximum with this camera to 10,000. And a maximum sensitivity with flash, the same thing. That's just, I don't really want to shoot images with this camera at greater ISO than 10,000. They get so grainy. Minimum shutter speed, I let the camera automatically choose that based on what lens I'm working with. And you can kind of tweak it. Do you want it to air to a little slower or faster? I think the standard is pretty good. We'll go back. Your white balance, that's something you can always change on the fly through your eye menu. I'll show you how to do that, how to set up your eye menu for that. I'm in automatic. You can choose. If you're shooting video, you need to really get your white balance right because it's very hard to change in post. So you want to choose a white balance that looks accurate and stick with it. And you probably don't want auto white balance. You probably want to lock in whether you're out in direct sunlight or cloudy or in incandescent or fluorescent light indoors. Setting your picture control. For shooting photos, if you shoot in a flat picture mode, it's going to give you the histogram. The histogram that's generated and the picture that you see on the back is a JPEG generated with these picture settings, even if you're shooting RAW. Flat will give you the best representation of what your RAW file actually looks like and a more accurate histogram. No contrast and no tonal adjustments are made to the image. It gives you a much more accurate representation of that RAW file. So I tend to leave that in flat. Manage picture control. You can create your own picture control settings. You can tweak the built-in picture control settings. It's pretty cool. Color space, this is really only for JPEG images. I choose Adobe RGB. It's a wider color space for editing if I did happen to shoot a JPEG. Active D lighting, that's something where it just boosts shadows and suppresses highlights a little bit when you're shooting for JPEGs. It can also work in video mode. That's something to play with and see if you like the effect. I usually use it some with video, but not with photos. It's really for JPEGs. Long exposure noise reduction. That's something if you're shooting long exposure still photos, do you want it to take a dark slide and shoot a whole nother image exactly the same length with the shutter closed and compare the two to see if there's any malfunctions with the sensor, any hot pixels, dead pixels, and repair that in the original image that you took. It's a really good idea when you're doing night photography and you have the time to do it. You can't do it if you're doing time lapse and you need to keep triggering the shutter because it takes twice as long for each exposure as it would without the long exposure noise reduction. But doing things like on a star tracker, you do say a 30 or 1 minute long 30 second or a minute long exposure, and then let it do that automatic calculation to get rid of dead pixels. I turn that on and off depending on the scene that I'm working in. High ISO noise reduction, that's more of a JPEG mode. I turn that off. I'd rather do it in post-production software. Whether I'm shooting video or stills, I'd rather do that in post-production. Vignette control, again, for JPEGs, I do a bit of that. It'll help with the lenses and they're automatic. Same thing with diffraction compensation. You know, if that's possible to do with your images, the digital lens corrections are just amazing with the new Nikon Z lenses. So I tend to leave that turned on. Auto distortion control, again, on. You know, it's going to be grayed out in some situations. Flicker reduction shooting, that's for if you're under artificial lighting and you're seeing kind of a flicker. It'll actually, if you're shooting stills, time your shutter so that it catches the brighter part of the light, not a flicker dimming section. And you can tune it in with video so that there's no flickering in your video. Metering, this is under photography, so we're just talking about stills right now. Metering, I like the matrix metering. It is so smart these days. It's very, very rare that I pull out of matrix metering. And when I do, I generally go into spot metering. It's that situation where it's a dark train station and there's a shaft of light shining on one table in a cafe. You know, I would then use spot metering just for the table because that's what I want exposed. I want everything else to fall to black. Otherwise, this camera, in almost every situation, from snow to rainy days, fog to bright sun, it does an amazing job knowing what is the correct exposure. Keep an eye on that histogram in your playback, but you'll find it's quite good. There's some flash control settings. We won't go into that. It's for off-camera flash or if you put a speed light on the hot shoe. Your release mode, you can choose between single frame, continuous low speed, high speed extended, or the timer mode. You're going to be able to get that from your eye menu easily while you're out shooting. Focus mode, AFS, that's single servo autofocus. That means once you lock that autofocus point and you get a green square, if you're using single point, it's going to lock and hold, and it won't continue trying to track that subject. If you use autofocus continuous, it'll continue if the subject changes distance from you to keep tracking it. And then there's manual focus. And then auto, the camera determines itself whether or not it should be in single servo or continuous. What's your area mode? There's a whole bunch of different ones. Pinpoint autofocus is great for landscapes. You get this tiny little pinpoint in your viewfinder that you can move around. I mean, tiny little pinpoint in your viewfinder. It's slow to move around. It's faster to use the little touch screen. You can touch this little place where it says off with the finger there, and it'll change to position focus point. Now it's easy to move that around just by tapping on the back of the camera. You can also have it touch and autofocus. You can also have it touch, autofocus, and shoot. And we'll go ahead and turn that off. So that's what we're talking about here. Go back into the menu. There's single point, which is a little bit bigger, moves around the screen faster with the D-pad. There's dynamic area, which runs around and it tries to kind of keep track of the subject if it moves around it a little bit. There's wide area autofocus. So, let's look at wide area for a second out here. Wide area gives you this square. It's going to look for eyes, faces, subjects within that square. Again, if you turn on the position point, using your finger on the back screen is way faster than trying to move it with the D-pad. Other cameras like the Z50 and the Z9 and the Z6 and Z7 are a little bit faster. This one's a little limited in its processing. So you got different shapes of wide area. You're saying I want to find a face or eyes or a vehicle or face or eyes of a pet or a person within this box. The subject that I'm interested in is within that box. And you have wide area, small and large. Large is a little bit bigger, as you see here. And you have it, so it's just looking for any kind of subject in there. Or you have it where it will look for people or animals. Animals with this camera means dogs and cats in general. It'll sometimes find other animals, but it's dogs or cats. Auto area autofocus completely gives the camera control, and you have auto area people, animals, or straight auto area. Auto area people, it'll find eyes within the viewfinder, and when it finds them, you can switch between them with the left and right of the D-pad. You'll see arrows. You can switch between people's eyes, and it's amazing at tracking faces and eyes, both for pets and for people. That's a great mode to be in. Vibration reduction. I almost always have this on normal. Auto bracketing. And that's going to be more lens dependent with this camera since it doesn't have built-in in-body image stabilization. Auto area bracketing, I generally leave it in auto area and then flash if you had flash on. It's rare we use flash with these cameras. So bracketing means automatically capturing an image that's on the light meter and then on your meter reading, and then one that's underexposed and then one that's overexposed. And generally, if you want to do that, I go down here, I choose 3 frames. If I arrow to the right, I can choose 5 frames, and I like them to be 3 stops apart. This is how you do HDR photography. To turn it off, you just go back to 0. So that's a really key setting to have there. I'll show you how to get to that really quickly in your primary shooting mode. All right, we go into multiple exposure. That's just for capturing as if you were in film and you didn't advance the film and took multiple exposures. You can do that digitally. High dynamic, and that's a JPEG only. High dynamic range, again, JPEG only. In camera, HDR, I think it's way better to do HDR in post-production software. Interval timer shooting, that's for time lapse. There's a lot of cool functions in that. You can run in there and tell it how many frames you want it to take and what the interval is going to be. And you can turn on exposure smoothing and have it work shutterless and tell it to focus or before each shot or not focus. And you can create a video while you're doing it and set the frame rate and size and all of that fun stuff. So it can be creating each still so that you can do time-lapse in post-production using more powerful software like Photoshop. You can also choose to put it into a new starting folder, which is pretty great. That way you know your time-lapse is in there. No, we don't want to leave. We want to, we've got a new starting folder. We want to say yes and say okay. There we go. So those are cool setups. Time-lapse video, that's an in-camera time-lapse video. Very limited ability to go in post-production and edit that in any way. But you can capture video in camera. Focus shift shooting, that's really powerful for situations where you can't get everything in the scene in focus, even say at f11 or f16. You can tell it, you know, I want a focus step width of really, really narrow for shooting a bug's eye like a microscope with a macro lens, or quite wide for a landscape image where you only need a few frames for the foreground, the midground, and the background. I use 9 in the landscape a lot. You can tell it the maximum number of shots you want it to take. And then you basically just focus manually or autofocus on the closest thing you're seeing and tell it to start. And it will start marching out at the step width that you set until it hits infinity and stop. And you can tell it again to put it all in a new starting folder so that you're easily able to identify where that focus shift shooting went. Silent photography, that just means shutterless. You can turn that on and off. All right. In our video recording menu, we're going to go in and you've got a reset where you can reset it all to defaults. You've got file naming. Again, I set it at Z50. You got your frame size and frame rate. 3840 by 2160, that is 4K. You have 3 different options for that. 30 frames a second, 25 or 24. Sorry for my cough. I have a little bit of a cold. The 24 frames a second is your typical cinematic look, that kind of Hollywood look. That is absolutely my favorite look for shooting video, and that's what I set it at. If you want to do slow motion video, you can do 120 frames a second, but you're limited to 1080p. So my standard setting on this camera would be 24 frames per second at that 4K 3840 setting. Video quality, that locks you in at high. That is high quality on this camera. Movie type, I like the movie files instead of MP4. Again, this is the same kind of ISO sensitivity settings. I generally leave the ISO sensitivity off of auto. When I'm shooting video, I like to lock my exposure settings. I don't want any flickering or changing in the middle of a video clip. White balance. I've got a preset white balance right now. I used a color checker like a white card in this room and made sure that my video is perfectly balanced neutral. Again, white balance is something you want to be very careful of when shooting video because it's not something you can edit after the fact. It's locked into that video. You need to get the color looking right. Picture control, again, flat. That, you know, if you're coming from shooting video with a phone or if you're coming from shooting video with a GoPro and you really don't want to do any color grading, well, then you should experiment. You should experiment and see if standard is kind of what you like. If you like that look. If you want way more color, you can go with vivid. If you want it slightly toned down, you can go neutral. If you want black and white, monochrome. I personally like flat. And flat is just going to give you the most latitude in post-production to go in and tweak the settings yourself. If you're in Adobe Premiere or Final Cut or one of those pieces of software, it's going to help you out, just giving you more ability to adjust the tone and color of your video file in post-production. So as we run down, manage picture control, you can do your own. Again, you've got all the same settings. You'll notice active D-lighting, I left turned off for photos, but I've got it set for normal. Yeah, you can experiment with those settings. That's going to boost your shadows and lower your bright, give you a little more dynamic range look. High ISO noise reduction, I'm going to leave that on normal for video shooting. Sometimes you can turn it off if you want to do post-production noise reduction, but the camera does a nice job. Vignette control, diffraction compensation, I leave that on for video. Flicker reduction can be auto. You can go in and change that to different settings if you want. Auto's worked well for me. Metering, again, I'm sticking with matrix. Release mode, if you're saving a still frame, usually single frame. If you push the shutter button and want to take a still while you're videoing. Focus mode. Shooting vlogging, you know, looking at myself with the camera, the full-time autofocus. It's constantly autofocusing, and then I put it in that auto area mode, looking for people and faces and eyes. It does a great job keeping my eyes in focus. Vibration reduction, I leave it on normal. You can leave same as photo settings. I leave it on normal. Again, that's lens dependent with this camera. Electronic vibration reduction, if you want a little bit more, it's going to crop in on your video a little bit and create sort of a vibration reduction just by it can move the frame of the video around. It's pretty amazing. That's how GoPro does its super stable looking video. And the Nikon's good too. If you're in a situation where it's looking rough and it's hard to hold still, you can turn on electronic vibration reduction. And it does a pretty good job. Microphone sensitivity. You know, this is one, its built-in mics are surprisingly good. The one thing I'm a little disappointed with all the Nikon Z cameras, as good a video cameras as they are, in actuality, as amazing a video cameras as they are, is that they haven't done better with their audio preamps. What do I mean by audio preamps? Well, when you bring a microphone line into this camera and say you have a lav mic like I have right now. I'm filming with a Nikon Z30 right now, and I have a little wireless receiver on the camera plugged in, and I turn my receiver all the way up and I turn my preamp down as low as I can to get my audio settings looking good, because if you turn your audio preamp on this up, it's gonna create quite a noisy preamp. That's the problem. The built-in mics are pretty good. You can experiment with auto, you can experiment with mic level settings and see what you like, but I'm just warning you that if you're using an external microphone, if you can do the preamp on the microphone itself, it's probably better than doing the amplification in camera. So when I go into manual, I try to set that number as low as I possibly can. Like right now on the Z6 II, I'm on level 2. Just a little warning there. I wish their preamps were better. I don't really mess with the attenuator or frequency response. You can experiment with that. If you're out in windy conditions with this camera and you're using its built-in mic, you might try the wind noise reduction. Time code is for synchronizing multiple cameras. If you're doing some kind of big project and using multiple different angles and cameras, that's a little beyond the scope of this. All right, so next we're going to jump into custom settings. That's a big bunch of stuff. I'm actually going to break for a sec and just cough it out for a second. I'll be right back. All right, we're back. Can't guarantee I won't continue coughing, but at least I got a drink of water. All right, so coming in, looking at sort of autofocus settings, you've got whether or not your autofocus continuous priority is on the release or focus. What that means is when you're tracking action, would you rather have it have a priority on capturing the instant that you're interested in or having perfect focus? I choose release for the autofocus continuous. Autofocus single servo, where you're really trying to lock a subject, I choose focus. I think that's the pretty much most people's standard setting. Focus tracking with lock on, that's when your subject and you're tracking something and locked onto it moves, say, behind a pole or a tree or another subject. How long does the camera wait before it lets go of that subject and looks for another? And I find that the default 3 setting's pretty good, but you can play around with it. How many focus points does the camera use? Well, if you're frustrated with moving the focus points around with the D-pad, you might use every other point. I tend to use all points and just touch the screen where I want to put especially with this where you don't have a viewfinder that you're looking through, you can just touch the back screen and set the focus point right where you want. It gives you more pinpoint accuracy. Store autofocus points by orientation. Well, that's a cool, I leave that yes, always. What that means is, you know, if I'm out shooting and I have my focus point over here, and then decide to go vertical, and I move my focus point to over here, well, does it gonna remember where I was when I go back to horizontal? And yes. So, you know, hopefully you're seeing, I know I'm not flipping the thing around up above me, but you get the idea. It leaves it right where you were last time you're shooting vertical, and goes right back to where you were when you're shooting horizontal. It's a really nice feature. Back into here, AF activation. Off. That's my preference. What that means is I only want my shutter to be, I want my autofocus to be on that back button. I don't want it to be on the shutter button. Now I know this camera doesn't have a back button that says focus, but you can program that little button that has the little key mark on it. next to it, and it says AEL, AFL. You can program that to be a back button focus. And if you're shooting this as a still camera, it's nice to be able to shoot without activating focus. I think that's the way that most of us who've been using bigger cameras for years, you like to use the thumb for focusing and the finger for shooting, and the two shouldn't be conflated. A lot of point and shoot cameras set that up that way. You'll find out of the box this camera comes set up so that the shutter focuses. You may really love shutter focus, and I'm not denigrating you if you do. It's just, to me, it feels like two separate things that you ought to have individual control over. There's times where you lock focus, even though you're tracking moving subjects, you lock focus and then you can reposition and shoot and not change the focus even though you moved the point off the subject. All right, that's my 2 cents, but that's all about back button focus. Whether we limit the AF area mode selections, if there's some you don't like, I'm not a huge fan of the dynamic area or wide area without people and animals, so I turn those off as you're cycling through those. Focus point wraparound. That's like when you're entering text in Netflix and you go off the right side of the keyboard and it pops up on the left side. It's kind of handy. For me, when I'm moving my autofocus points around the screen, if I'm using the D-pad, it throws me off. If I hit right one too many and it pops up on the left side, I'm old school. I turn that off. It can go off the top to the bottom, off the bottom to the top, off the left to the right, and vice versa. It's totally your choice. I turn that off. Focus point options, do they come up when you're in manual focus mode? Sure. You can play around with it. It's not that big a deal. It shows you whether or not you're focused in dynamic area, and it shows you whether or not you're focused in manual focus. It's whether those points are on. Low light autofocus, yes. Low light autofocus is amazing with these Z cameras. You can work in really low light. The focus will slow down a little bit, but it'll lock a subject in low light. It's crazy how well it works. I like to turn that on. Now, if you're finding that the autofocus is just slowing down in low light situations and you'd rather not get as accurate a focus or misfocus a whole bunch in low light situations, go ahead and turn that off, but I think you'll love it if you turn it on. Easy exposure compensation, I don't do that. That makes it so that you can simply, if you hit this question mark button, it'll tell you, you can adjust exposure compensation without touching the button, and I don't do that. The back wheel makes it so that if you bump that, it changes exposure compensation. So it's taking you over or underexposed as compared to the meter instead of having to push the button to do that. I'd rather push that exposure compensation button up there near the shutter button. If you're going to use center weighted metering, you can change how that's set up. I don't really use center weighted metering. Fine tune your optimal exposure. If you find that your exposure is a little bit off compared to the way you like it in this camera, you can force it to over or underexpose. I've never had to do that with a modern Z camera. So shutter release on the button, shutter release button, auto exposure lock. Does the shutter release lock exposure? I don't have it do that. You can set it up so that you get your exposure and hold the shutter button halfway down and lock exposure before you shoot. I don't do that. The self-timer has these settings. You can tell it how many seconds you want it to wait. You can tell it how many shots to fire. You can tell it the interval between each photograph. This is the kind of thing I put in my menu so I can easily access it when I'm doing that selfie shot of the group. Power off delay. I have this thing set to just not power off right now. I find the stock settings are pretty good. If you mess around with this too much, you can really blow your battery. I have it set to like infinity in 10 minutes for all the different modes that I'm using right now because I don't want it to time out while I'm doing this video. But I will set it back to its defaults before I use it again. Okay, so now we're into the shooting display. And anytime you want to jump around between these, you can, we've gone down to D now. We're at the start of shooting display. So how many frames per second is continuous low speed? I think 3 frames per second is pretty good. What's the maximum number of shots per burst? The highest is 100. I leave it at that. Exposure delay mode. Exposure delay mode's awesome. We're going to put that in the I menu so we can get to it really quickly. What does it do? You can tell the camera that it waits between 0.2 of a second, half a second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, in between when you push the shutter and when the camera actually fires. It doesn't have a mirror. So it's actually going to wait that amount of time and take the photograph. So it's kind of like having a cable release without using a cable release, or an infrared remote control without having a remote control. You just push the shutter, take your hand away, you're not shaking the camera, it takes the picture. It's great in doing low light, long exposures. Shutter type, is it electronic, is it mechanical, or is it automatic? I just let it be automatic. Let it choose between whether it's doing everything just by turning the sensor on and off or actually using a mechanical shutter in front of it. The camera's gonna make the best decision on that. Unless you need it to be quiet, and then you can activate silent mode, which we'll put in the My menu. The file number sequence, I just leave that turned on. Apply settings to live view. This is really important. Some people get this turned off and they won't see any effects on their image when they change shutter speed and aperture or ISO. You want to turn that on. Now turning it off will get you a nice bright view of your scene no matter what, but it won't reflect your exposure settings. And that's the beauty of having an electronic viewfinder, which we don't have in this camera, but an electronic screen that's showing us what our image is going to look like when we capture it. That's the beauty of mirrorless. I like a framing grid display. I like it to be 3x3, so it's a rule of 6 type grid overlay. When you see my screen, I have that grid active. I like that. Focus peaking, do you want it turned on? What level do you want it? 2 is sort of standard. What color? Red is kind of nice. When you're manually focusing, you'll see little glimmering sparkles in red around what's in focus in the image, and it's great for manual focusing. View all in continuous mode. I just generally leave that on. If you don't turn that on, you won't see each frame that you're capturing in continuous mode. You definitely want that. With this camera, you're going to get a little bit of a stuttery view if you're shooting in high speed continuous, as many frames a second as you can. But it's definitely something you want to turn on so you can see what's happening while you're shooting. The flash sync speed, I put it at the highest possible without going into that sort of reduced intensity auto mode where it's only doing a part of the flash with each move of the shutter. Flash shutter speed, I usually put that down around a 30th of a second. I may change it depending on what lens I'm using. That's kind of the lowest it's going to go when you're hand holding and shooting flash. Exposure compensation for flash, whether it's the entire frame or whether it's the background only and it's trying to like reduce the background exposure while keeping your subject bright in the frame. I usually do entire frame, but that's a total creative decision. Not going to go too into flash photography here with this camera. Auto ISO sensitivity for flash, whether that's the subject or the subject and background, I generally do subject only. That's a longer topic. Auto bracketing mode, this is important. So in your auto bracketing mode, if you're using flash, I think you should bracket the flash before you bracket shutter speed. So, and I don't want to bracket aperture ever. So I set my auto bracketing to be flash and then shutter speed. Rarely am I using flash and wanting to bracket at the same time. Bracketing order is super important. Some people set this to under and then the meter and over so that when they look at images in their grid, when they download it, say in Lightroom or on one, they're going to see the underexposed frame, then the on the meter, then the overexposed frame. Seems bright to be dark, medium, bright. But the problem is that the first image in your bracketed sequence will be really underexposed. And so you'd have to remember, well, I need to set this to be 3 stops underexposed for the first frame. That's the way Nikon does it. I'd rather set the exposure, the on the meter reading, and just know that when I download my images, it's going to be on the meter, underexposed, overexposed. People get really confused when they set it up the other way. Just trust me, the natural meter under over is the way to do it. All right, now we're getting into some cool and important stuff. We're customizing the controls and the settings. So in the I menu, this is where I talked about, we can turn long exposure noise reduction on and off. To change this around, you just push the OK button, and you have this long list of stuff to choose from. You'll roll through. And I'm just showing you what I've chosen, and I'll explain why. So long exposure noise reduction, that's a really great thing to be able to turn on and off depending on what you're doing in long exposure photography. Monitor brightness. This camera, all you've got to monitor, so adjusting the brightness. If you're shooting at night, you're gonna wanna turn it down. In bright daylight, you wanna turn it up. Image quality, are you shooting RAW? Are you shooting RAW plus JPEG? If you're shooting JPEG, what size JPEG? White balance, we've talked about how important that is in video. A little less important if you're shooting raw files with stills. This is the stills menu. Metering, what metering mode am I in? Occasionally I go to spot metering, and I don't have to dive through the menus to do that. Interval timer shooting. I love to shoot time lapse, so I put interval timer shooting here in the menu to access it and say, this is the interval I want to shoot. I want to shoot 240 frames to get 10 seconds at 24 frames a second. Exposure delay. I told you how important that is for long exposures. It's like having a cable release or remote control without even deploying one. Focus shift shooting. We talked about that when we went through the focus shift shooting menu. This is going to let you set what that step width is and capture multiple images to blend with focus stacking software like Helicom Focus or Photoshop. Bracketing, auto bracketing, turning it on and turning it off, and how many frames are we going to capture? 3. How many stops apart? 3 is my recommendation. Your autofocus area mode, whether you're into that pinpoint, whether it's the small area, whether wide area, whether auto area. Autofocus or manual focus, are you in autofocus single servo where it locks focus? Are you in autofocus continuous for moving subjects? Are you manually focusing? So that's what I like to have at a moment's touch. When I'm out there shooting, I hit the button, boom, I have all my choices here. You see, I'm right now in wide area, but I could touch that and then touch auto area for people, and I could touch autofocus continuous, and now I'm ready to track moving people around the frame. That simple, all right? That's how we utilize that stuff. Okay, so back into the menus. Still in controls, we're going to go into custom controls for shooting. This is my just general shooting mode. The function 1 button, you can see where it is on the camera. It's highlighted in yellow right there. Function 1, function 2. Function 1, I like bracketing, so I can turn that on and off with a touch of that button and a roll of the back dial. Front dial is going to adjust how many stops are they apart. Back dial is going to adjust how many frames. So if I'm out there shooting and I hold my function 1 button in, it's going to be able to adjust. The front dial controls how many stops. The back dial controls how many frames. So now I'm shooting 3 frames, and you can see I'm in auto exposure bracketing. If I want to turn that back off, it's as simple as a click. All right, let's go back into our menu again. Controls, custom controls shooting. So function 1 is actually bracketing burst. I said that wrong. Function 2 is bracketing. So function 1 is bracketing burst. What does that mean? That actually means that if I hold that button down and hold the shutter button down, it takes all of the frames in the bracket. If I have my bracketing set to capture 3 frames, differentially exposed, holding that button down and hitting the shutter button will capture all 3 with one press. I don't have to go and activate the timer mode or anything like that. And so my function 2 button controls the settings for bracketing. Function 1 button held down when I hit the shutter captures all 3 frames. My AFL button, that becomes my autofocus button. We set that custom setting in the A mode under the autofocus settings to be back button. Now we're setting that back button. That button, AEL, AFL, is now my focus button. I've set that to autofocus on. The OK button is reset. What does reset mean? Reset means reset the autofocus point to the center of the frame. My movie record button is depth of field preview. What is depth of field preview? That stops the lens down to let us see how much of the scene is going to be in focus at final aperture. You would think that mirrorless cameras would let you see that no matter what, and a lot of brands do, but Nikon stopping down at f5.6 to save its autofocus capabilities. So, and I don't know why they can't just automatically switch that. This is a thing that bugs me personally, but you have to hit the depth of field preview button to preview apertures smaller than f5.6. And so I set that to the movie record button when I'm in still mode because it's easy to reach with my index finger and I can get a view of what the scene looks like and then I can hit the shutter button. I don't like to program anything to the movie record button that requires me to use the front and back dials at the same time because it's just awkward. Especially while you're holding the camera, it's awkward to try to move your finger around. So I leave those wheel control buttons to the function 1, function 2 buttons on the front and map that depth of field preview to the movie record button, which is not active when you're in still mode. My lens function button, if I have a lens function 1 button, I have it be playback. If there's a lens function 2 button, it's a bigger, longer lens like the 100 to 400 that I have here on my Z9. So lens function 1 button, I can instantly play. That's more important if you're looking through a viewfinder. And autofocus, it's just I don't have to even move. It's just another way to focus. Again, I think this is less important with a camera with no viewfinder, but it's just how I set it up. Your lens ring can control manual focus. A lot of the Z lenses have rings that you can control. This one's right here on this camera. You can set it to be manual focus. You can set it to be a number of things. It can be aperture. It can be exposure compensation. It can be ISO. I just generally leave it at manual focus. That's it. So that's the custom controls for this guy. Custom controls for playback. I don't do a whole bunch. I have that AEL, AFL set to mark an image as protected. That way I can't accidentally delete it unless I format my memory card. It won't delete with delete all. It will delete if you format, but it protects it from deleting accidentally. If you love an image, mark it for protection. And then the OK button, when I'm in playback mode, automatically zooms in. If I press that, I can choose where I want it to zoom in. I want it to zoom in to 1-to-1 magnification, so I can really check focus. All right. Customized command dials, I don't change those around. You can change them, what direction they roll. You can set up some things. I don't do that. Your release button to use dial, that's if you press, say, exposure compensation, then you can use the dials without holding the button down. I don't do that. You have to press it to turn it on, press it to turn it off. If you like that, you can do that. Reverse the indicators for your meter, whether you want minus to be in the right versus the left. I like the left. I've been shooting Nikon a long time. For people coming from other camera brands, though, this simplifies things. If you're used to looking at it the other way, you can flip it here. Now we're going to get into some video customizations. The video menu, I have picture control. This is the I menu. So when you hit the I button on the back screen shooting video, when you're flipped to video mode, I've got picture control, which is really important with the video mode. White balance, super important with video mode. Your frame size and frame rate, important in video mode. We went over that when we were in the video shooting menu. Microphone sensitivity, important to be able to get to. You can turn on and off wind noise reduction. Metering, again, important. You can choose your Wi-Fi connection to be on or off. Active de-lighting, that's more important in video mode. Electronic vibration reduction can be super important. Vibration reduction, that's built in on your lens. And then your focus area and focus mode, again, right there. Those are good things to have in your I menu. You can customize it to your own taste, but that's how I have mine set up. Customized controls, I have subject tracking set up to be on function 1. I'm not going to do any bracketing in video mode. Subject tracking, when you're in auto area mode, you tap that, it'll put a little yellow box up on the screen. I'll give you a view of that if I was in my auto area and that's what the subject tracking looks like. You can move it around the frame and then lock it if you want on a subject. It's not working too well in a black scene like this. But in video, it's really nice to be able to put that on a subject and lock the subject. Function 2 is live information display off. What that means is if you have a grid on your screen, if you have all your exposure settings and all the different camera settings, by touching function 2, you get a clean view of what your scene is. Really important in video to be able to see exactly what that video frame looks like. Back button, again, I still have autofocus on. The OK button resets the focus point to the center. Shutter button takes a still photo. Lens function button can lock autofocus and lock auto exposure if you want. Yeah, there's several things you can do with this. Save focus position. There's several different possibilities in here. I don't use this very much. It's funny, I don't think I have even changed it. I might just set it back to playback because the last thing I want to do is accidentally lock exposure. lens function 2, plus I generally have exposure locked in video mode anyway. I don't want automatic exposure, so it's kind of useless. Lens function 2 can be autofocus on, so that way it's the same as with my stills mode. And the same thing with the lens dial. You might put that in video mode. You might want to put power aperture, so it just smoothly motors through different apertures. If you wanted to change aperture, something you could think about doing. All right. Autofocus speed, I generally leave that set at default, but you can make it focus faster or slower, which is important in video. That look. Tracking sensitivity, again, I leave it kind of set to 4. That's if your subject goes behind something, how long does it try to hold it? Do you want it to display zebra stripes in highlights when you're shooting video? I can't show you this because it doesn't transfer the video shooting view. It would just give clean video out via HDMI. But it gives you this sort of moving zebra stripes in overexposed parts of the frame. That's really handy in video so that you know if you're really blowing out a lot of your image. And I tend to leave it on with that sort of basic pattern 1. And I set my display threshold at 248. That way it's showing me everything really close to blown out and blown out. If you think about what it's saying is when we record tone, we record it in 255 levels of tone when we're recording. And so 248, 248, 248, if you hit that in all 3 color channels, it's going to start showing you zebra patterns. If you set it at 255, it's only going to show you a completely blown out white, not the very brightest gray plus white. So it's going to be hard for you to know that you're starting to blow out and save. So I set it at 248. All right, and that is pretty much, we'll just go back, the bottom of our custom settings menu. We'll go into the setup menu and some of those other menus and after just a quick short break. All right, that's the last intermission, I swear. We're gonna go in, we're gonna hit the rest of this. We're through the custom settings menu. We'll run quick through the setup menu. You can format your memory card. Remember, if you format your memory card, it's gonna format any saved settings on that memory card as well as any protected images. It's going to completely nuke the card. So make sure that make sure you don't lose your saved settings or important images before downloading them. Save user settings. That is going to save settings to the user 1, user 2, user 3 menu. And that can be super handy. You know, if this were a camera with a viewfinder, I would showcase some ways to set this camera up for action shooting. In fact, maybe I will really, really quickly. I'll show you an action shooting scenario for this camera where you might want to change just a couple of settings to make it easier to shoot action. And so let's say you wanted to be able to quickly go into action shooting with the user 3 setting. I might leave my camera. I'm going to go into display here so you can see where I'm at. I'm in manual mode. I'm going to show you all of my settings right now. If hitting that display menu cycles you through different views with this camera. And we're going to see everything here. And I'm going to set my shutter speed. I'm in manual mode. So I'm going to go ahead and set shutter speed up to something that would capture, say, a bird in flight, 1250th of a second. I'm going to set my aperture as wide as possible. I've got my ISO set right now to, I'm going to hit setting. ISO is set to my base ISO, but I have auto turned on. When you hold down the ISO button on this camera, the back dial changes your ISO setting. Base is 100. And the front dial changes whether it's auto or not. So that's really, really handy. That's a quick way to change ISO. So I'm set to be ready to capture action in manual mode, but auto ISO, wide open aperture, fast shutter speed. And then I want to go into my menu settings that we just did and change a couple of them really quick. I'm going to go into my controls setting and I'm going to customize the controls and I'm going to switch what's going on. Oh, we're in playback. I meant to customize controls for shooting. We're going to switch. We're not going to bracket while we're shooting action. I want my function 1 button to change so that it's subject tracking. Okay? All right. So now that button will activate that subject tracking box if I'm having a hard time, if the camera's not catching something in, say I'm in animal mode, auto area autofocus, and it's not seeing the animal, I can hit function 1 on the front of the camera and activate that subject tracking box and really quickly put that box over my subject and lock it with the back button. And then if the animal suddenly becomes larger in the frame and I think the auto area is going to do a better job, I can hit that function 1 button again and it will automatically go back to my normal mode. All right? So I've changed that. I want to make sure that I'm in the correct focus mode that I want. I would maybe, let's say we're setting this up for wildlife shooting. I'm going to go into my eye menu. I'm in autofocus continuous, but I want animal eye detect. All right. So now I've got the camera set up the way I would like to shoot if I was in my wildlife shooting mode. So what I'm going to do is go in my menu. I'm going to go down to the settings, save user setting, and I'm going to save it to U3, save settings. Boom. Now, all right, let's say we go back. Let's change everything that we just did back. I'm going to go into my custom settings menu, controls, custom controls shooting, and I want to change that guy back to what I really want, which is bracketing burst. And then in my settings, let's say I go to aperture priority mode, and I'm at 2.5 seconds right now at 3.5 aperture, right? But let's say I turn the dial on the top of the camera to user 3, 1250th of a second. Instantaneous. And if I hit that function 1 button, that subject tracking box I can move around to lock a subject is there. If I hit it again, it's off. All right. If I go back into manual focus, now that is bracketing burst again. So it's just a way to lock it in. You know, it even went into manual mode and set the ISO, the shutter speed, the aperture, the focus modes. Those are all locked in place. The one thing that I wish was locked in place and that isn't is your drive mode. You would have to go into your drive mode button and change to a faster drive mode, like high-speed continuous extended. I wish that locked in place with the user settings. It doesn't. It seems crazy to me that it doesn't. That's a complaint to Nikon. All right, so enough of an aside. That shows you how to use that cool setup menu, save user settings. Reset user settings would obviously reset that all to nothing, so that will obliterate anything you have saved. Language, that's for changing from English to Arabic or Spanish or whatever you'd like to use. Time zone and date, for setting your time zone and date, obviously. You can do that by connecting this camera to the SnapBridge app on your phone and then just tell it to coordinate whatever your phone's setting for time and date are. That's really nice. That way you don't have to worry about it when you're traveling. Just connect to SnapBridge, boom, it updates. Monitor brightness, we already had that set in our eye menu. Monitor color balance, you can change the color balance if you don't like it. Record lamp brightness, there's a video recording lamp on the front of this that's really nice. I think that it's set at a nice sort of mode right there. If you were out in really bright or dark conditions and you found that that red light was lighting your scene, you might want to turn it off or set it to 1, but it's super handy to know you're recording looking at the front of the camera. Time-lapse video recording, you can turn that off probably. That's how I'd prefer to have it. We go down through information display, dark on light. I like that kind of modern look instead of white on dark. That's your own choice. You can autofocus, you can fine-tune lenses. I don't find the need very much with the mirrorless autofocusing. It's so good, but you can. That's where you would do it. Non-CPU lens data. That's for telling the camera if you have some old lens you're using with this camera through the FTZ adapter. I'm using a 20mm lens. It's a 20mm 1.8, and so you can go in and do that if you want. And you can number it, and it'll remember up to 9 lenses. Save focus position. This is an interesting one. I put this in my menu generally. And the reason is, you'd think, well, why wouldn't I want it to remember? You know, the newer lenses are focused by wire. It's more of an input device, the focus ring on it, not something that's actually changing the lens elements around, unless you're using an older lens through the FTZ adapter. Any of these modern lenses, if you have it saved focus position, it will remember exactly where it was when you turned the camera off, when you turn the camera back on. If you set that to off, it automatically focuses the lens to infinity when you turn it back on. That can be handy too, particularly if you're doing night shooting, you know, Milky Way or something like that. So that's something, you know, to choose whether you want on and off. Dust off reference photo, that's if you got a really dusty sensor. These sensors are easy to clean. You know, it's something you can use. Pixel mapping, if you start to have dead pixels, you can map them. It's not been a problem for me at all with this camera and all the testing I've done. And it has been a problem with me with my Z50 over the years that I've had it. So it has the exact same sensor. I wouldn't expect you're gonna have much problem with your Z30. Whether you wanna make comments on your image, you know, I don't tend to do that very often, but you can type comments on your image. Copyright information, you can go in and type in the things you'd like your images to be tagged with in metadata. I think it's a good idea to do that. So I do that. Beep options, I turn it off, whether your camera's gonna beep when things are focused or not. I find that annoying, I turn it off. You can leave it on if you want. Whether your touch controls are turned on or off, I like them on. I think the touch screen's great. Self-portrait mode, I enable that so that when I flip the camera or view the screen around, I can take self-portraits. HDMI, these are settings for doing HDMI out. Like right now I have it set so that as it goes out to the switcher going into my computer, you can see all this stuff up here. You can see what's going on. You can turn that off. You can just change how the HDMI settings are for, you know, if you're doing out to a recorder. Turning on airplane mode, turning it off, connect to smart device. That's where I said connect it to SnapBridge to update all your settings. Connect it to a computer if you want to download images, that kind of thing. If you have a wireless remote control, you can change its settings. We're not going to go into all that, but conformity marking, it's going to give you information about its standards. USB power delivery, yes, I love having that. You plug a USB cord into this with power delivery capability, and it'll power the camera and charge the battery at the same time. It's great. Energy saving in photo mode. Yeah, I like to have my battery last longer in general. I like to lock the camera so it won't pretend it's taking pictures when there's no memory card. You can turn that off if you want, but that's just a good way to get in trouble and think you've been taking pictures when you have no memory card to record them on. Save and load menu settings. This is important. Save your menu settings to your card. I really recommend you do that. That's recording all the settings that we've done and locking them into your memory card. That way, if you accidentally change something and you want to go back to where you were, it's loaded on your memory card. This is a good thing to put in My Menu. And that way, before you format your card, you can load the settings where they're at that starting point in case you've changed anything, then format your card, then save your settings. Reset all settings, that would set it back to factory settings. Firmware version, this is where you can check what firmware you have, and if you get new firmware, you can download it to your memory card from your computer, put that file on here, go into here, it'll see it on the root directory of your card, and you can update from this particular point on your card. Retouch menu, I don't do any retouching on the camera. If you want to explore this, I go through your menu or your manual. I don't do anything about it. My Menu, here's where we get into some cool stuff. So, format memory card, that's a good thing to throw in your My Menu. Self-timer settings, great thing to throw in your My Menu so you can get to it easily. You run through and add things from the menus to this menu so that you can easily access them. All right, so flash shutter speed. I said sometimes we want to change that depending on what lens we're using. There it is. Exposure compensation for flash, you can change it right here. Save focus position, change it right here. Monitor brightness, change it right here. Airplane mode. Flicker reduction shooting, if you want to change the settings. HDMI settings, connect to smart device. Power off delay. These are all things I want easy access to. I didn't see, well, I guess I do. Save focus position. You can add items by jumping into any of the menus and just scrolling through them and choosing the thing you want to put in there. AF activation. We could say okay, and then we can move it down and say we want it at the bottom of our My Menu right now. Boom, saved. Now it's there. See how that works? You can remove items. Ranking items lets you move them around in the menu. It's as simple as that. So again, you know, if you find different ways you like to set this camera up for different shooting scenarios, whether they're video or stills, you can use those user 1, user 2, user 3 settings. Set it up exactly how you want it in, say, manual mode with the focusing modes that you want, with all of your settings the way that they are, and then go into that setup menu item, save user setting, and save it to the U1, U2, U3. Those are really handy ways to just set up the camera to instantly be in a mode that you want, just by flicking that top dial to where you want it. Remember, it doesn't change your release settings. Sadly, you can't program in whether it's in high-speed, continuous, or single. That's Z system wide, and it's something I really wish they'd consider changing. So, yeah, ever talk to your Nikon rep, let them know that you wish that would be included in the user setting saves. If you enjoyed this setup video, I'd love it if you'd subscribe to my channel. My voice isn't always this hoarse, but liking this video and subscribing is a great way to help me out. You can also check out my video review of this camera. I linked it at the beginning of this video, and every Thursday I put out videos called Approaching the Scene, to share with this community just different musings on photography. Sometimes it's about Nikon, sometimes it's about video, sometimes it's about stills, sometimes it's about time-lapse, sometimes it's about a location or video editing in Adobe Lightroom or on one Photo Raw. It varies week to week, and really the community drives that content. So by subscribing and commenting on the videos and sending me emails, I'm easy to get a hold of. That really drives the content on this YouTube channel, and you as an audience are what's most important to me. So I hope you'll join me for the journey and subscribe, and I thank you for watching, and I hope that you have fun with your Z30. It's a great little camera.